everyone, and welcome to the second edition of our webinar series. Today we'll be focusing on understanding your child. So last time in our webinar series we looked at connecting with your child and how you go about the intricacies of that. Some of the important things were to maintain the connection. Okay, so what this does is it enables your child to know that they are welcome and that they have the space, or rather that it's a comfortable position for them to be able to come to you whenever they do need to talk about something, which is definitely quite important in terms of being able to understand them. The second thing is being able to get to know them. And what I mean by this is knowing that not just that, hey, this is my child, I'm the parent, but what actually makes them tick. So the ins and outs, what do they like, what do they enjoy, what do they dislike? I think as parents we all think we know these things, but sometimes it does go a little bit deeper. So making sure that you understand your child's interests so that you can engage with them. I mean, if you think about it, anyone wants to talk about things that they enjoy versus things that they don't. So being able to understand your child on that level, again, it just maintains that connection for you. Being able to accept without judgment. This is quite a difficult one for some parents sometimes because our values might be different to that of our children, but it's important to understand that when we want to maintain a connection, when we want to understand our kids a little bit better, being able to accept them without judgment. I'm not saying that you can't have your own feelings and values, but rather do it in the room when they're not there. Sometimes if they might express things like gender and sexuality, values or ideas that might be different to yours, or even religion, some of the more controversial topics might be quite different to the values that you have. But being able to accept them and listen to them and hear what they're saying in that moment is quite important. Like I was saying, do it in the other room. So if you do have certain things that you feel about what your child has said, rather unpack that by yourself, not in their presence. Because I think if you remember in our last series, we spoke about any form of judgment being a deterrent to them ever feeling that they can come in and speak to you again. So quite important that they feel that they are not judged and rather accepted and welcome. The space is available for them to talk about certain issues. The next thing to remember is just that not every experience with your child is a teaching and learning one. And I think this is quite difficult for parents because we often think, my role as a parent has to be, to teach my child at every single moment. But it's actually not. Being able to just be there for your child sometimes is more than enough. If you think about when someone cries in front of you and you don't really know what to do, just as a person in general, and then you think about, poking them with a broom, just being there with the person is good enough for them. Sometimes you don't have to say anything, but just sharing the space with them is important. So being able to do this with your kids as well. Remember that sometimes they would come to you as just being a sounding board, and we spoke about problem solving and giving them the space and the opportunity to be able to problem solve by themselves is quite important. So earlier I spoke about, stepping into their world or getting to know them. Get involved in the things that they like as well. It might not be skateboarding, it might not be for you, but things that you can enjoy with them. Maybe going with them to the skate park and just watching YouTube videos about what it's all about is quite important, because this gives you access into their world and it shows them that they can trust you and that you can trust them as well. So quite important to remember just in terms of laying the foundation of being able to understand your teenager. Another one that I almost forgot is putting yourself in their shoes. Sometimes as parents and as older individuals, we often forget that we've gone through similar struggles. It may not be, copy and paste what they're going through exactly at this time, but we have been teenagers ourselves. So being able to kind of revert back to that previous version of yourself and understand what the experience was like, being able to be empathetic and putting yourself in your child's shoes. And like I said, not having to just teach or have it as a teaching and learning experience, but rather as something that, you have with your child to say, okay, that might be pretty difficult for you, or I'm wondering what that feels like for you. Let's talk about that. When I was a teenager, I experienced things like this, to show them that, hey, my parent is not just this older person that has never experienced anything that I have, but also has some kind of shared experience to me. Something that I see quite often in therapy is that parents or let me put it this way rather, a parent's real job, and I think I touched on that a few minutes ago, a parent's real job is actually to make their teen or their children's lives much easier. And sometimes as parents, we touched on roles and relationships in the last series, but sometimes parents blur these lines. And it's not your fault. Sometimes you think that, you have that openness with your child and you discuss certain things with them. But if anything, not discussing things that don't involve your child with them is quite important. So like I was saying, in therapy, quite a few times kids will come in and talk about how they have this added pressure on them about things going on at home. And also, if we think about where teens are, they are at this rescue kind of phase in their lives, and all they want to do is save the people around them and be able to connect and really help out. So if we add this load as parents of these are the troubles going on at home, whether it's financial or relationship problems with yourself and your spouse, it becomes extremely difficult for kids to kind of manage this, because it's not the place where they should be, where their focus should be rather. So being able to have firm boundaries as a parent and to understand what the relationship is between yourself and your child, not that it's friend, but that it is parent and child, but we can be friends to some extent. So always remember, your job is to make your child's life easier, and that is through teaching them certain skills, but also not blurring certain parental boundaries. Very, very important. So the first thing that I'm going to touch on is physical health. Now, I'm not a doctor, so I'm going to go through this section quite briefly and then rather focus on the mental health side of things. But there are some things that are quite important that do lean towards mental health issues. And if you think about the period of adolescence, oh my goodness, so much is happening in your body. So many changes, so many things going on. You are struggling to find out who you are, and on top of that, your voice is breaking. You've started with your menstruation, your body is changing in so many different ways. And on top of this, we have social media, which adds a completely different lens and layer to things, where we have to look absolutely amazing in every selfie that we post and get as many likes and follows as we possibly can. So all of these things add a whole bunch of pressure to our young people. So just some of the things, if you think about it, acne, something as simple as that, but having a pimple and, oh my gosh, how am I going to deal with this today when I get to school? Everyone's going to see this, everyone's going to notice, or did I wax my legs today, or whatever the case is. So this is where, your job as a parent can be to ease the transition for your child, talking about what is normal, what should be acceptable, and what they should really focus on. Having one pimple doesn't really matter. It shouldn't be the complete focus when you have your June exams coming up, So normalizing certain experiences for your child and helping them through the more difficult ones. So if you think about things like body image, can be very, very difficult for kids. I'm not growing as fast as my peers, or I'm not as tall, or whatever the case is. Being able to be there for them and explain these things. This, again, if we think about things like genetics, becomes quite important. This is what I went through as a child. This is probably what you can expect to go through. Maybe give it some time. So if we think about the phase of adolescence, a lot of what they go through is based on external validation. And if we think about the physical changes that one goes through during this phase, it's quite important that we manage it correctly, because if we don't, we end up with a lot of mental health issues. So like I said, some of the physical impacts the mental. If you think about things like body image and posting a selfie, say for example on Instagram, and I'm not as thin or as tall or as whatever as the people on Instagram, this could lead to things like eating disorders, self-esteem issues, anxiety, a whole bunch of things. So it's important that we understand in terms of where our kids are at developmentally. We understand their resilience, and I think that is one of the biggest roles of being a parent, to be able to build resilience in your child. So even if I'm not fitting into a certain stereotype, that it is okay for me to look the way I do and feel the way I do, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's important to also note that when we become adolescents and we move into high school from primary school, from the more earlier adolescent phase, the shift may move from the more sporty, cultural activities onto a more academic focus, which is what we see a lot in high school. So obviously, if we're taking away things like the PE, the traditional PE, or some of the sporting things that our kids would have been engaged in, and focusing more on academics, that kind of strips away that. And then if we couple that with all the changes that are going on physically, that aspect is lost. So if you can kind of maintain that for your child, whether it's going to gym or walking around the block, or running, whatever the case is, or just trying to keep active with your child, and like I said, normalizing certain things and building that resilience in terms of their physical health, quite important for the major change that they would be experiencing during adolescence. So in terms of my focus, the mental health issues. So just some stats that I wanted to run past you guys. Stats are always so exciting. 1 in 7 10 to 19-year-olds experiences some form of mental health issue or mental health disorder. Now that is quite a big number. If you think about your child's class, let's say there's 20 kids, 21 kids in the class, at least 3 of them will have some kind of mental health issues. And starting as early as 10 years old. Depression and anxiety are the leading causes of illness and disability among adolescents. And these are quite severe disorders if you think about it, because they can move all the way up into adulthood. So if not tackled correctly, you're sitting with a problem that starts very young and that can last quite a long time. Suicide, one of the 4th leading causes of death among 15 to 19-year-olds. And I think we can all just reflect on how big of a serious issue this is globally. We are losing a lot of teenagers to suicide, and it's for things that I feel can be prevented with early intervention, things like bullying, self-esteem issues, treatable illnesses, if anything. So being able to understand your child is so important, and that's the focus of tonight. So I'm going to take you guys through some of the warning signs, some of the things to look out for in terms of these, but I just wanted to kind of get through these facts. Obviously, like I said, a lot of these might start in adolescence, but continue all the way up until adulthood. So in practice, not necessarily at school, but in my private practice, I see a lot of clients, older clients that come in, and when they talk about their presentations, a lot of it actually started in adolescence. And I'm talking 40, 50-year-old individuals. So it's important that we understand where our kids are at and we try and intervene as soon as possible. Early intervention is key. I think if anyone can agree with that, let's agree on that. So if anything, not being able to intervene and not being able to understand or identify these things is essentially limiting your child and their development. Now, we could do the best we can in terms of academics and cultural and sport, and providing all the resources available. But if we neglect mental health, serious problems can arise. There's nothing worse than having an amazing job but being depressed or being anxious and not being able to live up to your full potential in your daily life. So some of the mental health issues, if we think about where teenagers are at, they tend to engage in a lot of risk-taking behaviors. And what I mean by this is there's this culture of peer pressure, and I know these are very cliche words, but they're very real words as well. Peer pressure and bullying. So like I said, a lot of it comes from external validation. How am I accepted? How am I viewed by my peers? If I don't do certain things, am I still going to be part of the friendship circle? Will they still invite me out? Will they still follow me on Instagram and Facebook and TikTok? These are all very real issues to teenagers. They might not be to us as adults because we've moved past that stage, but to an adolescent, these are the things that they're dealing with on a daily basis. And obviously, if we don't tackle these things correctly, it's going to have an impact on how they deal with their schoolwork, because that should be the focus right now, and building good, solid connections. So like I said, risk-taking behaviors, things like indulging in substances, there was this really, really strange trend that I saw on Facebook the other day where kids were actually jumping off the balconies and hanging off the side. And this was this new trend that was going on in school. And the child in the photo was actually on the third floor and hanging off a balcony. And I'm just thinking to myself, my goodness, just for a photo or a TikTok video, when you could slip and fall and probably injure yourself very, very drastically. So things like this is what I'm talking about in terms of risk-taking behaviors. There's also a lot of sexual activities that tend to happen. Hormones are raging at this point. Trying to find out who you are in terms of sexuality and gender. Not having the proper understanding and education around these issues could be very, very drastic. And sometimes we think that, oh no, if I have to address these things with my child, I am enlightening them or opening up the doors for them to engage in certain things. But if I can bet you something today that your kid probably knows more than you do about some of those issues. And I see it on a daily basis in practice, where kids will tell me about various substances or sexual activities. And I just think to myself, if parents knew that this is the kind of knowledge you have, I think we'd approach this as a society much differently. So rather have the conversation with your child, because there is nothing better than equipping them with the knowledge and the skills of how to handle certain situations. You telling them about sex or drugs is not opening the door for them. If anything, they engage with numerous people on a daily basis, face to face, and then on social media as well. Remember that information is readily available on the internet for kids. They are extremely curious. If you had to go through their Google searches, you'd probably be able to see that. So rather having the conversations around these risky behaviors and having the skills for them to build that resilience, like I spoke about earlier, is paramount. So anxiety disorders, these are the ones that kind of relate to panic and excessive worry. Definitely starts at a young age. If you think about it, having to focus on my academics, having to focus on, do my friends like me? All of these things, if not dealt with correctly, can breed and turn into these bigger monsters than we want them to. So also thinking about the pressure that we as parents put on our kids. You have to do well. If you don't, then I'm going to take you out of the school, or I'm going to move you, or I'm going to do this, or you can't hang out with your friends. Sometimes we think, and I definitely believe that intentions are good as parents, but how it's received to an adolescent could sometimes cause a lot of undue anxiety and pressure. Okay, depression shares quite a lot of similar symptoms as anxiety, but obviously comes the persistent sadness and depressed mood. If we think about things like, I'm not able to make friends, people don't like me, I look different, or this is wrong with me, okay? Those things can, again, breed and lead into more adulthood kind of problems. So we want to be able to have these conversations, maintain the connection that we have with our children so that they do feel comfortable coming to speak to us. Another thing that I do see in practice quite often is kids saying, my parents are there, but they're not there for me emotionally. And for a parent, this might be very difficult to hear, because you think, but I'm here, I'm doing everything for my child. I give you the best resources, I send you to the best school, and I buy you everything that you need, and you're fed every day. But essentially, these are not the things that kids see. These are big things for adults, but kids want someone that is there for them emotionally, someone that is there to listen, someone that's there to understand what they're going through. So being able to connect with your child on that level, opening that door, understanding them better, helps with a better parent-child relationship, helps with creating a better person that can navigate society better one day when you are not there. And that, I think, is the biggest goal of being a parent. Eating disorders are another big one that we see in adolescence. Like I said, the physical changes that start happening with the body and the external validation, terrible combination. Those things should never ever be introduced to each other, but unfortunately they are, and the result of that turns to be eating disorders, which are extremely difficult for young people to go through and would definitely warrant some kind of psychological intervention. Trauma, something that we often overlook. This could be the loss of a loved one. I think we've come out of the come out. I'd like to think we've come out of the pandemic, but a lot of people have been lost during this time. A lot of change has happened, and that could be extremely traumatic for someone that doesn't really understand the intricacies of something like that. Being involved in traumatic events, physical abuse, emotional abuse, neglect is also a type of abuse, and sometimes we don't really acknowledge this. But not being able to meet your child's needs, sometimes, as best as our intentions are as parents, is or can be rather traumatic for a child. And obviously this trauma is deep-rooted, and as psychologists we often like to look at trauma, childhood trauma, where we speak about what happened to you as a child, or take me back to where you think this came from. But it does have its place, and it does have significant effects. And then we have things like personality disorders. These are often things that start in adolescence but rear their head a lot later. But being able to identify this is important for the sake of early intervention. And then I think, it's just important to touch on a lot of other kind of disorders that our kids face. And these are things like learning disabilities, things like ADHD, autism, a whole bunch of things that make it difficult for kids to kind of navigate their spaces and the environment. Let's start looking at some of the risk factors for mental health issues. So increased stress, increased fear, increased anxiety. And this doesn't necessarily have to be just from the child, but it could be learned behavior. Sometimes as parents, we not only pass on our beautiful brown eyes, but sometimes our behaviors as well. Children do what they see rather than what they hear, which is what we'd like to believe. But sometimes an unhealed adult can pass on certain trauma, and this is generational trauma or generational behaviors to a child. An anxious parent sometimes makes for an anxious child. So things like that is quite important. How we handle ourselves as parents impacts the way our children handle themselves. If I'm going to stress about certain things in a certain way, I'm showing my children that this is how they should kind of relate to a similar situation. So being able to understand how you relate and not passing that on is quite important. History of family mental health issues is obviously quite a significant one. So parental depression, personality disorders in parents, things like anxiety. A lot of these can essentially maybe not be passed on, but obviously impact the parent-child relationship. If you think about something like bipolar or borderline personality disorder in a parent and the attachment style to the child, you looking at a distance parent-child relationship where the child does not have the emotional care from the caregiver that they need. And if anything, like I was speaking about last time in our last webinar, where children kind of learn about relationships from their parent relationship. This is kind of speaking to a distant relationship in friendships, in romantic relationships for the child as well. So quite important to kind of address that. Negative family environments. This is things like substance abuse, alcohol abuse, just difficulties in the family system itself. And it does not necessarily have to be the nuclear family, it could be the extended family as well. Sometimes, like I said, it's not our intention to pass these things on, but the way we manage the family obviously impacts the way the child perceives it, and that's quite important. Mistreating children in any way, shape or form is obviously going to impact them. I think that's quite straightforward. Family conflict, things like peer pressure and bullying that I touched on earlier. Loss of support in any kind of way, shape or form. Sometimes, the teacher that I knew very well is leaving the school, and this is really significant for me. The pastor at church or the religious leader, at mosque or wherever, has kind of left, and this is someone that I felt like I could connect to. Oftentimes, I think I was touching on this earlier, but maybe not in the depth that I was looking for, is children often feel like they don't have the emotional support from parents, and they feel that I don't actually have someone that I can go to that's an adult to help me with certain issues. So sometimes when they do have this person, the loss of that support is taken away. The loss of maybe an academic structure at school or supporting structure, a coach or a team, anything that would support them in any kind of way could have drastic effects. Supportive relationships. we think of friendships in childhood as something that is not that stable and not that consistent. But for a child or an adolescent, this is extremely important. This is how they understand themselves, through their relationships with others. It's only kind of later on that they understand, okay, I need to have a relationship with myself, and that's my modus operandi, if anything. So kids kind of use that as their sounding board. And the loss of friendships, if you think about moving from grade 7 to grade 8, and none of my friends came with me to my new school, and I have to kind of find new friends, or I'm moving to a different class, or whatever the case is, changes a lot for kids. Also, the lack of consistency. Kids really thrive on routine, being able to do similar things, obviously with some kind of spontaneity, but doing similar things quite often or every day is important for them. But also a lot of change. If parents' jobs, call for them to kind of move quite often, this is a loss of support that kids could really benefit from. So what are some of the warning signs? We're speaking about understanding your children. So in terms of their mental health, what are some of the warning signs that you can look for as a parent? I know that's why we are all here tonight. Long-lasting sadness or irritability. So I'm not just talking about, I'm really sad today. I'm talking about like this is happening over a couple of days now. My child seems to be on edge, very irritable. If I ask them to close the gate or wash the dishes or do their homework, they're quite snappy. Okay, that kind of behavior change, if not normal for your child, is definitely a warning sign. Any kind of outbursts, that are not like your child. So getting in the car and slamming the door, I don't want to talk to you, I want to have nothing to do with you, okay, could be a warning sign. Extremely high or low moods, so very, very excited or very, very sad all of a sudden for a continued period of time, definitely is indicative of something brewing under the surface. Excessive fear, worry or anxiety, like I mentioned, and not just, the normal, I'm about to write a test or an exam's coming up or I have a speech tomorrow. This is like going on for a little bit longer. So everything needs to be understood in terms of context. It's important to kind of think about it as a little bit longer than what we would write off as normal excessive worry or sadness. Social withdrawal, one of the big ones. If you find that your child is not talking to their friends anymore, doesn't want to engage with peers, it doesn't want to talk to their friends outside of school, not really on social media anymore. This is definitely one of the bigger signs of some kind of mental health issues or something going on under the surface. This is apart from the normal, I want to say normal behavior of not wanting to engage with parents. I think part of adolescence is understanding that I'm separate from my parents and trying to understand like who I am, and sometimes just liking to be in your room by yourself with headphones on. But if you notice that alongside some of the other things that I've mentioned, then it is definitely important to kind of intervene. Dramatic changes in eating and sleeping. So this is either excessive eating or eating way less, and then the same for sleeping. So sleeping like 15 hours a day or sleeping 3 hours a day. Definitely something going on there. So it's important to check in with that. Withdrawal from previously liked activities. So I know that Sam loves to play piano, or he really loves rugby, and he all of a sudden does not want to engage in that. Or Mary completely loved, gymnastics, and all of a sudden I don't want to do gymnastics anymore. Important to kind of engage with them and find out why that is. If they don't want to speak to you, then there could be something else bigger going on, and then I think intervention is important. Decline in marks is another big one. So if your child was like a 90, 70 student and all of a sudden getting like 50s or 30s, definitely something happening there. So it's important to interrogate that and then look for the support where needed. Something that parents often miss is self-harm, and there's nothing wrong with that because they do their best to kind of hide this from you. But if it's the middle of summer and you find that your child is always wearing long sleeves, or the new trend of tending to always hold your jersey like that, there could be something going on. But it's important to note that kids won't only cut or burn or any kind of self-harming behaviors on their arms, but on their thighs as well, and on their tummy area. So maybe just sneaking into the room when they're getting dressed now and then to see what's going on. I know it's quite invasive, but it is important if you suspect some of these other things are happening to kind of just check in for that. But just on the note of self-harm, and I will touch on that in the next webinar series a little bit more in depth, is that self-harm is not necessarily suicide. It is a means of regulating. It is a means of asking for assistance. So understanding it as that, not freaking out completely when you see your child doing something like that and punishing them, which is the complete worst thing that you can do. So at the top of this, I spoke about accepting without judgment. This is one of the cases where you understand and you say to them, whatever it is that you're going through is probably very difficult for you, and this is why you've had to resort to something like that. But let's see what we can do to get you some help. So yes, self-harming behaviors, but it doesn't always have to be cutting or burning. This could be engaging with substances or some very risky behaviors. Some people will tend to headbang or hurt themselves in certain ways, like slamming their foot in the door continuously. So any bruises or kind of strange marks you see on your child is worth interrogating, I think, as a parent. So we spoke about kind of the global mental health picture, but something I touched on earlier and I said is quite important for us to just turn the focus on to is suicide. Like I said, we've lost a lot of children to suicide, a lot of people to suicide, and I think if we can intervene, if we can help out, it's definitely our place to do that. So some of the warning signs of suicide: obviously very low mood all of a sudden, or even very high moods. Sometimes we find that with suicide, people will be very happy or very excited in the days preceding the event. But talking or making plans about suicide. So often kids will come to you like, oh, what would happen if I wasn't here anymore? Do you think anyone would miss me? How would the family look like, if I wasn't here? So as soon as you start hearing statements like that, coupled with things like self-harming, coupled with some of the other warning signs that I've just addressed, please, please, please intervene, okay? Expressing hopelessness about the future. I don't want to go to school anymore. I don't see a point. I don't want to study. I don't want to get a job. There's no use. What's the point of trying anything if nothing ever works out? So any kind of hopelessness or ideas of hopelessness, please, please, please intervene. Overwhelming or displaying some kind of sense of, severe pain, severe trauma, severe distress. If your child is constantly teary when you just say hello, please, please interrogate that and see why they could be feeling like that. So then I think some of the other things that I've kind of noted: changes in sleep, hostility, agitation, significant, depressed mood, irritability, and withdrawal or changing in the school environment as well as in the social environment. If you can, as a parent, they're probably going to hate you for this, but it's okay. This is one of the things that come with being a parent. Try and get on your kids' social media accounts. Try and get their buy-in, because that's where you see them posting a lot of things like this. So they might not say any of these things to you in terms of the plan that they might have or the hopelessness that they might have, but definitely posting on social media. I'm not saying you have to kind of interrogate them with everything that they post, but if you see some red flags, definitely chat to them, or maybe chat to a friend or someone that knows them well enough to say, hey, has so-and-so been okay at school? What's happening? Oftentimes, kids will have pseudo accounts. So if you know that your child has a certain nickname, possibly trying to look for that account. So they'll have the parent account that they add you on, and then they have the real account where all the, as they say, the lit stuff happens behind the scenes. So trying to get into either one of those. But if anything, if you think about it, if you think about real good relationships, if kids feel like they can trust, that they can come to parents, that they have the understanding, the acceptance, they'll be as open as possible, and you'll be able to get anything out of your child. So essentially, your goal should be to develop that kind of relationship with your child, so that you don't have to do the snooping behind their back, because that would obviously destroy the trust that they have in you. So yeah, I think that's it from me, but I hope this was helpful. I hope that this helps you to better understand your child, or at least think about some of the things that I've mentioned today. So yes, if you have any questions, anything that is particularly concerning to you, please reach out on my email address. You are also welcome to ask some questions or email other questions or comment on the video. I look forward to seeing you all in the next series. Our final webinar for this series, but hopefully this is adding to your manual of how to parent better in terms of your Gen Zs.